Choosing Eddie Rickenbacker as my topic was easy. Not only was he a true American hero, but he also tried his best in everything he did. No matter how tough his life got, Eddie's faith in what he believed in never wavered. He stayed true to himself, never letting society change his way of thinking. He lived an accomplished and respectable life, a life all should strive for. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born to poor Christian immigrants from Switzerland on October 8, 1890. He was the third child of 4 brothers and 3 sisters. His parents worked for years to save enough money for a plot of land, and when they were able to purchase the land, Eddie's father, William, built a very simple house there. Even before Eddie attended school, he was working in his mother's garden and helped supply his family with coal by picking up pieces that had been dropped by loaders and had fallen by the tracks. Eddie was always interested in building machines. William Rickenbacker encouraged Eddie to keep building, as long as the machines had a purpose and as long as Eddie could manage it. As for his faith, Eddie's mom, Elizabeth, read passages from the Bible and taught him how to pray. Anxiety plagued Eddie's childhood. He became rebellious at a very young age due to the resentment he had toward his older brother. He began to smoke and blackmail his brother at age 5 and found other troubled boys and started the Horsehead Gang. He dabbled in illegal activity and found himself in trouble with the authorities, but that did not stop him. His activities with the gang became more and more reckless, which almost cost him his life. These events began to have an adverse effect on young Eddie. One day, Eddie had an epiphany that if he died, everything around him would continue as though nothing happened. This caused him to spiral into a depression. His father caught him crying one day and punished him for worrying about death at such a young age. This seemed to help Eddie realize that he was wasting his time panicking, and he decided to quit the Horsehead Gang and find a better meaning to life. Eddie got his first real job at age 10 because he believed a boy could not become a man until he established purpose and accountability in life. Unfortunately, at age 13, he had to really step up to the plate when his father unexpectedly died. Eddie knew he needed to help his mother financially. He began accepting odd jobs whenever he could, and finally, after telling a few lies about his age and education status, he was able to obtain a job at the Buckeye Steel Casting Company that paid $1 a day. Eddie knew with this job that his family's financial burden would vanish. Eddie was a hard worker with a love for inventing. This was his passion until he discovered his love of racing. Before Eddie started his career in racing, he worked at a couple shops repairing and building car parts. One day, Eddie's boss, Mr. Freyer, requested Eddie to accompany him to New York for a race he was participating in. Unfortunately, Freyer did not win, but he was offered a job as chief engineer of Columbus Buggy Company, and once again brought Eddie along with him. In 1910, after a few years of working, Eddie had the chance to compete in his first race. He joined the Duesenberg team and started competing in back-to-back races for 2 years before going solo. However, going solo did not suit him, so he joined a 3-man team which included Barney Oldfield and Bill Carlson. Being a part of his team was the greatest part of Eddie's racing years. After many successes, Eddie was asked to race in Europe from 1916 to 1917. Sadly, World War I was developing in Europe, and all U.S. citizens abroad had to return to the United States, ending Eddie's career in racing. At that point, Eddie was earning $40,000 annually, a huge income for that time. As soon as Eddie returned to the U.S., he was ready to help the war effort in any way possible. He began touring throughout the state to draw up support for the Allied cause. Eddie also started preparing for the Flying Squadron. However, military officials weren't too fond of his reputation during his racing days. Also, they were interested in men under 25 having college educations. Eddie was 27 and barely educated, having left school at age 13, but he still did not give up. His determination worked, and with a falsified medical document, he was ready to begin flying. After training in France for 17 days, and learning how to control a .30 caliber rifle and machine gun, Eddie was dispatched to the 94th Aero Squadron and eventually became squadron leader. Eddie was just as quick flying as he was racing. His ability to hold his fear in check while flying made him unstoppable in the air. On September 14, 1918, Eddie was promoted to captain and deputy commander of the squadron. He took to the air and shot down his sixth enemy plane. The next day, he downed his seventh, earning him the title of American Ace of Aces. His aviation methods proved effective against planes and German balloons. He developed a flying technique in which two planes would attack a balloon while the rest of the squad protected the two pilots. Eddie said, "Fighting in the air is not sport, it is scientific murder." Eddie formed close bonds with the men he served, and he took each death to heart. When his friend Captain Ham Coolidge was killed, Eddie and several other men went to the crash site and conducted a burial service while under constant shell fire from the Germans. Eddie would jump back into battle when he could see a comrade being attacked, even if his position was compromised. His loyalty and bravery earned him the respect of the men he fought alongside and the American public. Eddie was born into a time of drastic change and conflict. The gasoline-powered automobile had just been invented in 1886, Henry Ford produced the Model T in 1908, and by 1910, Eddie was driving race cars in the United States and Europe. In 1920, he opened his own Rickenbacker Auto. Aviation took a leap from the Wright brothers in 1903 to the plane Eddie flew in World War I. The first non-stop transatlantic flight took place in 1919, and the Zeppelin airship flights began in 1928. Eddie worked in the commercial airlines industry from 1929 until 1963. There was almost constant threat of war. World War I, World War II, Korean conflict, Vietnam War, not to mention the other Cold War incidents the United States was involved in. Eddie served in World War I and ran secret missions during World War II. He was a statesman and knew many world leaders. Frank Sinatra, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and Danny Kaye hit the big screen, and Marilyn Monroe became America's sweetheart. Eddie would have been entertained by all these Hollywood favorites. Eddie was involved in the making of more history than most men. The world changed dramatically from Rickenbacker's birth in 1890 to his death in 1973, and the amazing Captain Eddie changed with it. One of the well-known stories of Eddie Rickenbacker is the time when he and 6 men were lost at sea. This occurred while he was on a secret mission for the government. While on flight to New Guinea on October 19, 1942, the pilot could not locate the island and made an emergency landing in the ocean. The men survived the crash, but spent 22 days in rafts in the Pacific Ocean. They had no food or water with them, so they had to rely on catching fish and rainwater. Amongst dehydration, many of the men suffered severe burns, and 1 man died. Just when Eddie thought all hope was lost, he heard a plane fly above his raft. The plane landed in the water and notified Eddie that the men in the other rafts were found and brought to safety. The plane's crew placed the most critical man inside the plane and then tied Eddie and the other man to the wings of the plane and flew them to a nearby boat that was waiting for them. After recovering in Samoa, Eddie flew to Australia and finished his secret mission. He was finally reunited with his family on December 19, 1942. In the aftermath of the crash, the Air Force redesigned their rafts and equipped them with emergency supplies. They nicknamed the rafts Rickenbackers. After World War I, Eddie married Adelaide Durant and adopted 2 sons. He remained focused on 2 things, cars and airplanes. He was vice president of Rickenbacker Motor Company until its bankruptcy in 1927. He purchased the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1927 and did not sell it until 1947. In 1920, few were convinced that airplanes would be a mode of transportation. However, Eddie began a cross-country tour endorsing air travel. The airline industry was finally beginning to catch on. Eddie accepted a position at Fokker Aircraft Company and in 1932 joined North American Aviation. In 1935, he became general manager of Eastern Airlines and later purchased the company. Eastern Airlines not only transported people, but it also transported mail. Eddie remained president until October 1959, but did not completely retire from management until the age of 73. The company was profitable under Eddie's administration. Okay. Here is a letter written by Eddie replying to the tiff he got into with a man named Oscar. Oscar was offended when Eddie was quoted in New York Times saying he would buy a case of scotch for Major Richard Bong, who beat his record of enemy aircrafts Eddie put down. Angrily, Oscar wrote a letter to Eddie saying that as a public figure, he should not be advocating the use of alcohol because young people are looking up to him. Oscar believed Eddie should be setting a higher moral standard. Eddie acknowledged the letter by writing to his friend Mr. C.M. Smith about Oscar. This letter gives insight on Rickenbacker's down-to-earth attitude in handling situations. What Eddie Rickenbacker accomplished in his life is something people only wish they could fulfill. As a child, he was a gardener, and growing up to adulthood, he was a salesman, race car driver, automotive designer, government consultant, pioneer in air and transportation, an American fighter ace, captain, head of Eastern Airlines, musician, the occasional golfer, and so much more. As a racer, he competed 3 times in the Indianapolis 500 and set a speed record of 134 miles per hour. Eddie was titled American Ace of Aces because at the time he was the best U.S. Air Surface fighter pilot. He also received the title Captain and Major. He was the highest decorated U.S. airman in World War I, and he was the second highest decorated soldier. He won 9 Distinguished Service Crosses, and later one was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. He received 5 Distinguished Service Medals and many other military honors. He had risen from being the son of a poor immigrant to a man of connections and means. He met with high-ranking military officials as a military advisor. He wrote a comic strip called Ace Drummond, books, appeared on postage stamps, and was interviewed by Life magazine. In Zurich, Switzerland, on July 23, 1973, at age 82, after fighting pneumonia, Eddie Rickenbacker took his last breath. As a Medal of Honor recipient, he could have been buried in the Arlington National Cemetery, but chose to be laid to rest in Columbus, Ohio, near his parents. The 94th Arrow zoomed overhead in the missing leader formation as final tribute to Captain Eddie. He left behind his wife and 2 sons. He also left a rags to riches story, a story of sadness and amazing courage. He was a man who faced his fears, tried his best, kept the faith his mother had shared with him as a child, and accepted his failures with his successes. He is a challenge to all to accept the circumstances that life presents and to rise above them. The world is a better place because of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker.
Among the first American flyers to make it to the front was Edward V. Rickenbacker, a man of remarkable resourcefulness who would go on to become America's Ace of Aces. Born in 1890 in Columbus, Ohio, the third of 8 children, Eddie Rickenbacker grew up in the American heartland at a time when the miracle of modern invention seemed to offer limitless opportunities for an industrious young man. When his father was killed in an accident, Eddie, all of 13 years old, left school for good and began working in a glass foundry. Working 6 12-hour shifts each week contributed $3.50 to the family fund. Rickenbacker's climb up the ladder next found him working for the Buckeye Steel Casting Company, now 14 years old and earning the princely sum of $1 each day. Next followed a job carving cemetery monuments that paid 50 cents more per day. After 3 months of breathing stone dust, Eddie took a job working in a machine shop for the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was here that the teen discovered his love for machines, and before long had secured a position in a garage, servicing a recent invention called the automobile. The mechanic's job was a slight step backwards in pay, but young Eddie quickly became expert in the care of these new machines, and was soon working for the Freyer Miller Company, a firm that was engaged in building racing automobiles. Before long, Rickenbacker basically knew all there was to know about gasoline-powered automobiles, and eventually became involved in their design. Next came a mechanic's job with the Duesenberg racing team, and finally as a race driver himself for that company. Over the next several years, Eddie Rickenbacker was to make a name for himself as one of the Duesenberg drivers, racing on all the famous tracks around the country, including the Indianapolis Speedway, and winning his share of races. At the end of 1916, Rickenbacker sailed to England as a representative of the Sunbeam Motor Company, with the intention of developing an English racing team. In England, the Germanic nature of his family name was cause for concern with the British authorities, and he found himself constantly followed by British agents throughout his stay. Eddie Rickenbacker was no spy, though, and on this first trip abroad, he was to become enamored to the British cause. Immediately upon his return to the United States, he began preaching what he called the 3 M's for the Allied war effort: money, munitions, and men. A year later, Rickenbacker again sailed for Europe, this time landing in France, where he was commissioned a sergeant in the American Expeditionary Force and given the job of chauffeuring staff officers around. His ability to repair motors in the field landed him the job as Colonel William Billy Mitchell's personal driver, and it was here that Eddie Rickenbacker became acquainted with the fledgling American Air Service. Colonel Mitchell, the great American military air pioneer, eventually secured Rickenbacker's transfer to the big flying school at Issoudun. At the age of 28, Rickenbacker was considerably older than his classmates, but his success at auto racing had demonstrated that he possessed fast reflexes and a keen eye. The first two American units to become operational were the 94th and 95th Pursuit Aero Squadrons, which set up shop at Villenoy in early March as part of the U.S. 1st Pursuit Group. Raoul Lufberry had managed to get himself attached to the 94th, but not as the squadron leader, which suited him fine, as his time at Issoudun had made it painfully clear how much he disliked the extra paperwork that accompanied the job. Instead, the squadron was to be commanded by Major John Huffer, a French-born American who'd been serving in French squadrons on the Italian front. Besides Lufberry, other Lafayette alumni who found themselves assigned to the 94th included James Norman Hall, Bill Loomis of Bedford, Massachusetts, and Alan Winslow, a native of Forest Park, Illinois. Eddie Rickenbacker, fresh from the flying school, also reported to the 94th towards the end of March. For aircraft, the two new American squadrons had been given Newport 28s, a fairly modern design, but considered a cast-off by the French units, who'd preferred the newer SPAD 13s. The Newport was a plane with good performance characteristics, being fast and nimble, but suffered the unsavory habit of shedding its wing covering in a long dive. France had allotted nearly 300 of these fighters to the U.S. Air Service, and although the first units were deemed operational by mid-March, it wouldn't be for several weeks until the machine guns arrived to arm the airplanes. For the time being, the American squadrons went aloft and familiarized themselves with the area while they awaited their guns. For a squadron emblem, Major Huffer suggested a hat and a ring, a traditional challenge to a fight, and the 94th was henceforth known as Uncle Sam's Hat in the Ring Squadron. By the middle of April, the squadron was fully operational, and on the 14th, Douglas Campbell had the honor of scoring the first American victory of the war. Campbell, a native of San Francisco, had abandoned his studies at Harvard upon America's declaration of war and had been one of the first cadets to enroll in the expanding air service. Within minutes of Campbell's first victory, a second German plane fell to American guns, this time to the victorious Alan Winslow. American journalists descended on the airfield at Villenoy to report on the accomplishment, and the exploits of their nation's double kill was splashed across headline banners of every major American newspaper. The United States had finally entered the arena of the Great War in the air.
America's frontline fighter in 1918, the SPAD. Speed about 120 miles an hour. Crew, one man, the former leader of the 94th Pursuit Squadron, America's ace of aces in World War I, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, today chairman of the board of Eastern Airlines.
Those of us who flew this little SPAD in World War I will never forget it. To us, it seemed just as deadly an airplane as the modern jet fighter. It's hard to believe, but we took this plane as high as 20,000 feet and without oxygen. Of course, we knew nothing about electrical heating apparatus or oxygen masks, but we discovered many things about the airplane in World War I. We discovered some of the first principles of air power and combat flying, and those of us who fought in that war came out of it with a pretty clear idea of what the future of flying might be. That's the way the whole aviation history has been. A few men glimpse the future and fly it out. Whatever the official and public attitudes may be, this has been true ever since the early days, from the Wright brothers and the beginning of air power.
To watch these two videos, drag your mouse over the black squares and press play.